Once upon a time, a long, long time ago, there was a Joan of Arc. Sometimes I wonder why an anthropologist like me should be so interested in a literary, historical, and mystical figure like Joan of Arc. There are three reasons why I'm interested in Joan. Firstly, Joan of Arc, Jeanne d'Arc, the Maid of Orleans, is the patron saint of our university. Secondly, when we look at Joan's life, she was a great student, a great teacher, and a great leader, three roles that we have always valued highly here in our community of scholars. And thirdly, Joan of Arc, both in her life and especially in her death, is a great mystery, and there's nothing an anthropologist loves more than a great mystery. Let us pause for just a moment before we retell the tale of Jeanne d'Arc, the Maid of Orleans, and remind ourselves of all the ways that Joan figures in to our lives here at Longwood. All of the Longwood Lancers would not exist were it not for the lance of Joan of Arc. All those cartoons in the rotunda, all the posters for Oktoberfest, and before there was ever an Oktoberfest, for circus, which pictured Joan of Arc on her charger, none of them would exist. In fact, a great deal of the iconography of our community is based around Joan of Arc, her lance, her sword, her horse, her armor, her bravery, her death, and of course, her statues. There are the two statues. The Joan of Arc statue in the rotunda, presented by the senior class of 1914, is a reproduction of a very famous one that was chiseled by a French sculptor, Henri Michel Chateau-Perel. The original of that, Joanie on the Stony, as we call her, is in the Museum of Luxembourg in Paris. The sculptor entitled the sculpture, Jeanne Listening to the Voices, but we came up with the better label, Joanie on the Stony. You know something? Joanie on the Stony has her 100th birthday this August. This August was when she arrived in the rotunda. The graduating class of 1914, true to what is often the case around here at Longwood, didn't get their act together quite in time, and the statue was supposed to arrive in April of 1914 in time to be on the stage for their graduation in June of 1914, but it never got here until August of 1914. And as a result, she didn't make it to graduation that year. But if she makes it to graduation this year, and there's a real possibility Joan may be graduating this year, it will be on her 100th birthday. She's been sitting in the rotunda, and a couple of other places on campus too, for 100 years this coming August. And then there's the second statue, the equestrian Joan. The equestrian Joan, which used to stand in the colonnades, but it's been moving around in recent years, was given to the State Teachers College for Women at Farmville by the sculptress. Her name was Anna Hyatt Huntington. She had made the original equestrian Joan for Riverside Church in New York City, a very famous Presbyterian church. And upon presentation of the original of this statue to Riverside Church, students at our college, way down here in Farmville, heard about it, admired the statue very much, thought it would complement nicely Joanie on the Stony, and they wrote a letter to Anna Hyatt Huntington, the famous sculptress in New York City, and said, "We want one just like it." And she wrote back and said, "The amount of money it would cost you would be prohibitive." And they wrote back and said, "Please, pretty please," or words to that effect. She was so taken by the poignant appeal of the students at our college that she decided she would make a replication of her statue at Riverside Church. She had sculpted that statue in a woodshed in Gloucester, Massachusetts. The horse that she used was the last surviving fire department horse of the fire department in Gloucester, Massachusetts, and for St. Joan, she used her 15-year-old niece. Well, our bronze replication arrived at the Farmville Train Depot April 5th, 1927, and our college archives still possess the American Railway Express bill for $85.15 to have it shipped from Massachusetts to Farmville. Mrs. Huntington came in April of 1927, and she unveiled her reproduction at the college. She was told that they would call the statue Joni on the pony, and she said that was fine with her. Well, let us look beyond these symbols, these local symbols of Jeanne d'Arc, the Maid of Orleans, and see what we can tell of the actual life, some 600 years ago, of this little girl. Jeanne d'Arc, Joan of Arc, that is in English, was born on the 6th day of January, the Feast of the Epiphany. That's the 12th day of Christmas, my true love sent to me, and all that stuff. The Feast of the Epiphany in the year 1412 in a small village in northeastern France named Domremy. Now, for years and years after Joan of Arc's birth in 1412, the farmers in that village told a story. They said that on the night when she was born, the Feast of the Epiphany, all of the animals in all of the barns and stables in the village gave voice, quote, each animal in its own tongue, so loudly that everyone in the village was kept awake all night. It was believed as a result of this occurrence that something good was going to happen as a result of that little girl. There are no descriptions of what Joan of Arc looked like as a little girl. We can imagine, based on paintings of little girls born in that part of France at that time, but there's no actual description or portrait of what Joan of Arc looked like as a youngster. The one thing we do know is that she had a bright red birthmark behind her right ear, and that seemingly innocuous thing probably helped cause her to die. We do know that there are descriptions written of Joan after she became quite well known as a leader of men in the army. Here's a description of Joan of Arc written just a year before her death at the age of 19. Her hair is cut very short. By the way, the armor that Joan of Arc wore when she was a great leader of men, freeing France from its enemies, the English, who had taken possession of France for 100 years during the 100 Years' War, the armor that she wore was preserved after her death. And measurements made of that armor by physical anthropologists indicate that she was probably about 5 feet 2 inches tall and weighed between 105 and 110 pounds. So at least we do know something of her size. Okay, here's the one written detailed description of Joan of Arc. This girl, this was written by one of her enemies too. This girl is good looking and with something very virile about her bearing. She speaks but little and is remarkably prudent in what she does say. She eats little, she drinks wine still less, but she manages both her horse and her weapons superbly well. She greatly likes the company of knights and soldiers and monks and nuns. She sheds many tears. She seems always to have a sad expression. And so great is her strength in the endurance of fatigue that she could remain completely armed during 6 whole days and nights of fighting. Isn't that something? A little girl, 5 feet 2 inches tall and 105 pounds, and even her enemies found themselves forced to write a description in those glowing terms. Until Joan was about 12 years of age, she apparently lived a normal life for a farm girl in a rural part of France at that time. But at the age of 13, something really unusual happened. She said that at the age of 13, she began to hear voices. The voices would often come at noontime, and most frequently on sunny, bright days. Sometimes when she was in her father and mother's garden, but most often when she was passing by a church. She said the voices admonished her to be a good girl, and it said, the voices, God has a special plan for you. Now, we have to understand something about what sort of world this 13-year-old girl was living in. Her country, France, had been occupied by the hereditary enemy, the English, from across the English Channel for nearly 100 years. France was at its last gasp. The English had taken possession of all of the main cities in France. The French people were very much fragmented. Some wanted to surrender to the English. Others wanted to continue the century-long fight. The Dauphin, the eldest son of the former king, could not be crowned king. He was supposed to be crowned Charles VII. He couldn't be crowned because the cathedral in which the crowning was supposed to take place had been held by the English for 70 years. The French seemed doomed, and into this world, this little girl is born. The Dauphin, if only he could be taken to Orleans to the cathedral and crowned king, had the possibility of rallying the French people and possibly defeating the English. Joan made a terrible mistake and told her father about the voices. He was terrified at the idea that his daughter was hearing voices, even more terrified when Joan said the voices recently had been telling her she would become a military leader. She would lead the French armies. She would take the Dauphin to the cathedral at Orleans and see him crowned king. She would save her country. The father, Joan's father, was terrified at the idea of his daughter riding off to war, and he told her rather than have that happen, he would tie her in a grain sack and drown her in the mill pond. This was not a very auspicious beginning for her career. Her father was quite a guy. In his village, he was known as a grasping, mean, and very intelligent man. It is said locally that it was he who had devised the system of ridging fields. Can you see in this picture that the field seems to have a washboard configuration? It is said that he had figured out that if you made ridges in your field like this, it would increase the growing area of crops by some 14 to 17%. And the French needed all of the land they could to grow crops, since the English owned a great deal of the best agricultural land in the country. Well, Joan was not discouraged by her father, and for a year, the year of her 14th year, she studied military science with soldiers. She studied the structure of the church with monks and nuns. She studied French culture with historians. And with her newfound knowledge and dedication, she made friends with the Dauphin, the pretender to the throne. Now, all of this might seem a little bit too much to believe, but it really all did happen. There was apparently something about this little girl, some charisma, I guess we would call it nowadays, that almost everyone recognized. At the age of 15 years and 9 months, she was given her own military unit to command. She was mounted on a black charger. All she had for a weapon, though, was a small little battle axe. And she really did need to have a big sword. They said to Joan, "Where will you get your sword?" And she said, "I know where my sword is. My sword is behind the altar in the church of St. Catherine in the village of Fierbois." Most people had never heard of the village. Joan had never been there. But so great was the belief of people in her that an armorer was dispatched from the French military headquarters to the church of St. Catherine at Fierbois. And there, in the chapel, behind the altar, the sword was found exactly as Joan said. It was sent to her, sheathed in a case of red velvet. This was taken as a sign that Joan had supernatural powers. That was good, and it also was bad. During the month of February 1428, Joan of Arc, at the head of 600 picked soldiers on her black charger with her white sword, made a triumphant progress from her village into the midst of the military fray. At each stop, she gained more and more supporters and more fighting men under her banner until she had the largest military unit in the French army. Beginning with small and then larger and larger engagements in a year of unbroken military victories against the English, Joan of Arc lifted the siege of Orleans on May the 8th, 1429. And 2 months later, July 17th, 1429, she escorted the Dauphin, and he was crowned Charles VII in the great cathedral. This coronation ended in front of this altar the French political chaos, and France had a chance to expel the English. Joan of Arc was now made commander over all French military forces. This made many people very jealous of her. It made the English hate her. It made the English sure she was a witch. And it made many French military commanders and politicians and others extremely jealous of the power that was now being exercised by this little country girl. Joan continued her military victories. 6 months later, on the way back towards Paris, she went through a small village. She had been warned that the English had hired French mercenaries in disguise to wait in that village and to try to assassinate her as she went through. She chose not to believe these warnings. There was a small lane outside the village. It's the type of small lane you still see nowadays in the English countryside. You know, they plowed the fields from the center towards the outside, and as a result, at the edge of the field, where the field joined the lane, there would form a ridge and a ditch. It's called a lynchnet. Deep down in that ditch were hidden the turncoats that had been hired by the English. They surprised Joan. Her escort turned back to retreat, and Joan attempted to cover their retreat alone. As a result of this, she was unhorsed and fell into a small stream near the field, near the lynchnet. Water and sand got inside her armor, and no matter how strong the little girl was, she just couldn't get back on her charger again. And she was taken captive, and she was turned over to the English, her mortal enemies. Between that date and a year later, May 30th, 1431, the date of her execution, Joan would be, in the words of Winston Churchill in his classic book, History of the English-Speaking People, Joan of Arc would be more powerful in defeat than she had ever been in victory. News of her capture spread far and wide. Some people were very sad. Some people, her enemies, were very happy. She was imprisoned, taken in a dog cart to a prison that the English maintained in a castle in a French city which they still controlled. The castle was occupied by her prime English enemy, the Earl of Warwick, a very bad man. And he had her put into a tower that was so cold, so damp, so restricted in the flow of air, without any visitors, with the poorest of food, that he hoped she would die as a result of the treatment. But she didn't. In fact, perversely, she seemed to flourish under all this adversity. It was clear to the English they would have to try her. They didn't try her, though, as a military commander. That would mean they wouldn't be able to execute her. Instead, they tried her as a witch. There was no doubt she was going to be convicted. She was not allowed to have any counsel or anyone to speak for her. When the trial began, it took 7 days for the 112 charges against her to all be read to the court. The court was made up of 4 males, old males. They accused her of using the name of Jesus and Mary and Joseph and many other saints and angels and archangels in a blasphemous way. Now, at this time, many people in France and in England were religious sometimes and not so religious sometimes. But one thing they were all united against was the possibility that there were devils living amongst them, subi and insubi, little creatures from hell that went around at nighttime into barns and stole the milk out of cows and that sucked the breath out of babies. Almost everyone believed this. You know, this guy probably believed it. He looks like he'd believe that kind of thing, doesn't he? Yeah. It was just a few years after Jean's death that a famous book was published, Malus Maleficarum, The Hammer of the Witches, and it told you exactly how to recognize a witch. You could recognize them by their breath, the smell of their breath. You could recognize them by what they ate and didn't eat. You could recognize them by small birthmarks behind their ears. Oh, there were 100 ways, and so many of these ways seemed to fit Jeanne d'Arc. Yes, the peasants in both England and France became more and more convinced as the trial went on that this young girl, even the French began to think she could not have done what she did as a military commander were she not somehow in league with forces of evil. Though she had saved their country and saved their bacon and saved their king, they turned against her because she was different. She was so wildly different. She was so young. She was so much a girl and not a boy. And she hadn't had any of those kinds of things which a leader should have: high birth, noble education, royal connections, and so on. Well, many of the charges settled around the point that Joan of Arc, coming from the countryside, would have known all those kinds of evil witches' brews that you could brew up and make yourself more powerful than a mortar should be. Some of these potions truly did have pharmacological active ingredients in them, like the small flower you see here, belladonna. It's a powerful poison. It acts locally on central nervous system endings. You feel like you're flying through the air. You feel like you can see in the nighttime. You feel like your skin is burning. Many witches said, yes, I am a witch. I fly through the air at night. After taking this belladonna, they would say that. There was another plant called henbane. People who were exposed to the extract of henbane frequently gave every appearance of being dead, even to the suspension of respiration. I guess that's what led very frequently to those accounts of people being taken on the dead wagon out to the burying ground and sitting up in the dead wagon before they got buried, because they weren't really dead. They were just in a sort of state of suspended animation. A famous contemporary anthropologist, a guy like me who works in Spain and Portugal and France nowadays, said that one of the most potent of the drugs that Joan of Arc is accused of having had access to is the mandrake root. The mandrake root, when taken in the form of a tea, causes the most wondrous hallucinations and feelings of grandeur. All these accusations were made against Joan. She was not allowed to defend herself. How do you defend yourself against accusations like this? It's sort of like, when did you stop beating your dog? No matter what you say, there's always the supposition that you haven't stopped beating your dog. Well, at the end of the trial, which lasted 6 weeks, the sentence was given: we strike you with excommunication. So she would be thrown out of the church, the very church she had defended. We declare that you are a rotten branch, and you must be severed from the body of humans, lest you infect it. We turn you over to death. The execution date was set for May 30th, 1431, and Joan was to be burned at the stake. Now, back to that cemetery again. Joan was a believer in the resurrection, and if she was to be burned at the stake, there would not be a body to be resurrected. That was all a part of the plot of her enemies, to, at the very last, strike her in what they knew would be the most terrible way. 4 large scaffolds were erected in a church, one elaborately hung with textiles and tapestries, one for the judges, one for the dignitaries. One was used as a pulpit for the man who was going to preach the execution sermon. But before the execution was held, there was an attempt to see if perhaps Joan could be made to recant, to sign a statement that she was a witch, she would agree to that, and perhaps then she wouldn't be executed. She was put in a castle again. Here you can see the remains of that castle. On the door of her cell was posted a sign. The sign said, Joan of Arc. She calls herself the Maid, but she is a liar. She is a deceiver of the people. She is a sorceress, a blasphemer of God, presumptuous and pernicious, defamer of the faith, boastful and idolatrous, cruel and dissolute, invoker of demons, apostate, schismatic, and heretic. She wouldn't give in. She wouldn't defend herself. So she was taken from the castle back to where the execution would be held. She climbed up onto that fourth platform, which was made of plaster so that it wouldn't burn while she was burning, and an English soldier helped her climb the ladder up the platform. She begged the English soldier to give her a cross. For a year, she hadn't been allowed any of the sacraments of the church and hadn't been allowed to read the Bible. The English soldier, who was her sworn enemy, tied together 2 small pieces of bent wood that he picked up off the ground and gave them to her. Those standing by said she put them into her shirt, and there were a lot standing by. This is the time when being hanged, being drawn and quartered, but especially being burned at the stake, was a spectator sport. People came from miles and miles. They slept on the sidewalk to get a good place to stand to see the execution. Executions were public spectacles. It is estimated that there were some 5,000 people, some friends and some enemies, and some curious bystanders who came to see Joan burned. The cruel sermon preached by her enemy took an hour, and it prolonged her agony. Now, in those days, when a person was to be burned at the stake, normally a last mercy could be purchased by their friends or family, or could be granted by the authorities. And the last mercy was allowing the executioner to pile a large quantity of green wood around the feet of the condemned person tied to the plaster stake. The smoke from the burning of the green wood would normally cause quick suffocation so that death would occur before the flames actually kissed the skin of the condemned. You know something? Anthropologists have figured out the backstory of that. The executioner would often be charged with going out to stables and hostelries and sheds and barns and gather the wet wood from around them, like this barn that we're looking at here. Maybe even from, mud puddles like that. Now, this wet wood in these mud puddles was subject to urine from farm animals. Farm animals go to the bathroom wherever they want to. And in urine, there is an acid, urea. When urea, which is in your urine too, by the way, that's where it gets its name, urine, when urea from goats or pigs or sheep, when it is heated to a high temperature, it becomes cyanuric acid and takes on a different chemical composition. It goes from being CONH2 to being C2N3OH3, which means that it's very astringent and it burns tissue. Cyanuric acid, if it can be gotten into an aerosol form, that is floating in the air so that it can be breathed, becomes cyanide. If the vapor aerosol form is anything organic, like burning wood, it becomes potassium cyanide, the same ingredient that is used in some death chambers nowadays in order to cause death for people who are condemned by our legal system. They say it smells like almonds when you take that first breath of it, which is normally your last breath. That burning green wood caused cyanuric acid to be inhaled by the condemned, and they suffocated immediately with the first breath. Well, I'm sorry I told you that whole story, because in the case of our Joan of Arc, the executioner was not allowed to get any green wood. Only dry wood was used. As the flames climbed higher and higher around the plaster stake, Jeanne d'Arc could be heard commending her soul to God and calling on angels and archangels, but especially, the bystander said, she called upon Margaret and Mary and Michael. And then there was greasy smoke that came from around her, and those who were most skilled and experienced in watching people burn at the stake heard the popping and exploding of the long bones in the body as the heat caused the marrow inside the shaft of the bones to come to a boil. And the cortex of the bones being a chamber, it caused the bones to explode. That caused the tissue, the flesh, to be blown off the body into the crowd. At last, according to an eyewitness, there came from the smoke and the exploding, popping sounds one word 7 or 8 times repeated. The word was God, followed by a moment's pause, a last long, loud cry, and then silence, except for the crackling of the flames. Now, at this time, according to legend, something really unusual happened. The executioner ordered that the embers be pulled away from the body and the plaster stake when the flames had died down enough for that to happen, so that everyone in the crowd could see that Jeanne d'Arc, the Maid of Orleans, the sorceress, was dead. When this was done, it was discovered that her heart had not been burned and that it remained wet and red with blood. This shocked the executioner. He ordered that a great quantity of oil and sulfur be poured onto the fire, and that all the embers and even a new load of dry wood be placed around the heart. That fire burned all the rest of that day and throughout the night. And the next morning, before dawn, in the darkness, the executioner ordered that all the ashes and whatever else remained of Joan of Arc be gathered up secretly in a blanket, and they were thrown into a river so that no relic of her would ever remain. The English soldiers who were still standing guard carried out this order, and a number of them said, "But white doves flew about them as they did so," and one soldier said he believed the white doves came from the flames. He later on said, "I knew then that we were lost, for we had just burned a saint." What is the significance of the life and death of this 19-year-old girl for us in our world? She was, Chaucer said, as sweet as a flower and as upright as an arrow. I think one significance is that Joan of Arc lost herself in a cause that other people would have lost themselves in if they had had the energy, if they had not been busy with something else, if they had not been afraid that people would turn against them. She wasn't afraid. She did have the energy, and she gloried in the fact that there were those who were against her, for she knew that she was in the right. She was in love with all of humanity. The king who could have saved her, the king, Charles VII, that she had led to his own coronation at the cathedral at Orleans, had the opportunity to save her, to purchase her from the English, but he didn't. He feared the power of this little girl. Well, after she was dead, Charles asked the mother of Joan of Arc if there was anything that he could do for the family. And the mother said, "Well, I know what John would have wanted. She would have wanted the possibility for the people who lived in her little village to live a happy life." And the king, nice guy that he was, had written into the tax rolls the following, which is still there. "For the village of Domremy, in the roll of the tax, from year to year, nothing for the sake of Joan of Arc." So even in death, she had a way of doing good things for her people. Few of us are going to have the opportunity to ever be a Joan of Arc. I think that's a true statement. Robert Kennedy said something about Joan of Arc and about all the people in the world who try hard to help others, even at great cost to themselves. This is what Robert Kennedy said before his assassination in 1968. "It is from small, numberless, diverse acts of courage and belief that our world is shaped. Each time a person stands up for an ideal, or acts to improve the lot of others, or strikes out against an injustice, there is sent out a tiny ripple of hope. And crossing over other tiny ripples of hope from a million different directions of energy and daring, these ripples can build a current that can sweep down the mightiest walls." I wish I could have been there in the rotunda the day this picture was taken. This picture was taken in August of 1914 when Joan of Arc came to our rotunda 100 years ago. And the truth is that I can be there, and you can too, through the words of a letter to the editor, sent to the editor of the rotunda, our school newspaper, by a student who was there for the unveiling of our Joni on the Stony, the very Joni who sits in the rotunda this evening. This is what part of the letter said. "We are fortunate to witness the unveiling of this statue. In a short time, however, we shall have passed on, carrying the ideals, we hope, of Joan of Arc in our hearts, and giving place to those who come after us." She was talking about us, those who come after them. "But not our statue. Our statue shall stand here. Nature in her wildest moments may beat about the material composition of this statue, but the real Joan of Arc, our patron saint, the spirit we know and love so well, she will remain. And each year as time goes by, new eyes will eagerly search for the truth embedded in her, and new faces will reflect the glory of her resplendent life. And thousands of students will pass by her day after day. May their hearts thrill anew as they sense the vision of what their life might be." An Anglican hymnist, F. Bland Tucker, wrote a hymn about Joan of Arc. He said, "She was as peaceful as a dove, and yet as urgent as a flame. It is a miracle Joan of Arc could have ever lived. She was truthful when lying was the common tongue. She was a keeper of promises when keeping promises was expected by very few. She was modest and fine and delicate when to be loud and coarse was universal. She gave her mind to great thoughts and purposes when other minds wasted themselves on petty fancies. She was spotlessly pure in mind and body when society was foul in both. And as her reward, her one-time friends and her enemies and those who were merely interested bystanders, they withheld for the last year of her life the touch of any human. They withheld the last year of her life any relative visit. They withheld the communion cup of her church and the comfort of rituals. And they took this noble child, the most innocent, the most adorable, the most brave that the ages possibly have ever produced, and they burned her alive at the stake. I love Joan of Arc. I want you to also. Thank you.